When World War II finally ended, the French film-going public found themselves inundated with American films that they had been unable to see during the Nazi occupation. It was during this time that cineclubs dedicated not only to watching films but discussing them through a critical lens became a popular pastime for French cinephiles. Meanwhile, in the United States, there was an economic boom, an exodus of bourgeois families to the suburbs, and an oppressive expectation of conservative conformity. Yet despite Americans' prosperity when compared to the Great Depression, there was a lot of anxiety about the stability of society, particularly regarding gender roles. Men who served during the war often struggled to reintegrate into domestic society, and women seemingly had a lot more power than in previous decades. The state of American society during the 40s and 50s and the growing movement dedicated to film criticism in France created the perfect storm to invent one of the most difficult to define film movements: film noir. Film noir, as the French critics saw it, was a movement in American cinema defined by its stylistic and narrative conventions that seemed markedly different from American cinema before the war. However, film noir was less of a reality and more of an idea retroactively imposed on a cycle of American crime dramas imported into France than an actual dramatic shift in American filmmaking. Still, the idea of film noir undoubtedly made an impact on film criticism and scholarship, and it is worth looking into what connections the French made between a somewhat arbitrary catalog of films. What constitutes a film noir? The definition has been hazy since its inception, with critics disagreeing on the importance of style versus substance as defining characteristics since the Cagé days. As James Naremore puts it, there is in fact no completely satisfactory way to organize the category of film noir, and nobody is sure whether the films in question constitute a period, a genre, a cycle, a style, or simply a phenomenon. Some critics claim that the stylistic elements of film noir, such as low-key lighting, deep focus, and off-kilter framing, are the key. Nearly every attempt to define film noir has agreed that visual style is the consistent thread that unites the very diverse films that together comprise this phenomenon. Paul Schrader even goes so far as to say that film noir is more interested in style than theme. Yet Raymond Board and Etienne Chaumeton, French critics and authors of Panorama du Film Noir Américain, have surprisingly little to say about visual style. The French were generally unimpressed by what Bazin called plastics or expressionist imagery. Another common way of defining film noir is through the characteristics of their stories. Janie Place connects the style of films noir to their narratives. Film noir's remarkably homogeneous visual style indicates a similarly homogeneous cultural attitude. Board and Chaumeton argue that there are noir narratives and noir characters, such as the tough, archetypal man for pulp stories, and the femme fatale and nurturing woman archetypes identified by Place in women in film noir. Yet these characters are not common to all films noir. Kiss the Blood Off My Hands, for example, lacks a femme fatale, which Place suggests is often the primary noir element of noir-influenced films and other genres. Moreover, if there are noir characters and noir narratives, how is film noir different from a genre? Schrader claims that film noir is defined not by convention of setting and conflict that define genres, but by the subtle qualities of tone and mood, and an overriding theme of a passion for the past and present, but also a fear of the future. But Place argues, the characters and themes of the detective genre are ideal for film noir. The moral and physical chaos is easily expressed in crime. So what separates film noir from the crime genre? By analyzing pre-war American influences on film noir, we realize that the answer to that question is not much. Though some critics such as Schrader attribute the early influences of film noir, particularly its lighting and cinematography, to German Expressionism, upon closer inspection, those elements stem from a more local film tradition. Among other elements, such German Expressionist devices constitute generic extensions of lighting and mise-en-scène conventions that also characterize the ambiance of outlawed American film forms, namely the 1930s American gangster and fallen woman films. Moreover, countless films from Warner Brothers and RKO during the 30s did indeed use these harsh lighting techniques, but the difference was that they were used in B productions, no-name director films which have never been looked at by auteur theory-influenced film scholars. The B production is probably the most overlooked influence on post-war crime dramas, as the darker and more pessimistic forms of crime film tended to be subsumed under Hollywood's B category of filmmaking, and certain aspects of the post-war crime cycle's experimental features can be contextualized under the principle of necessity being the mother of invention. For example, Robert Siodmak began his career in American cinema working on B productions for Paramount, which likely influenced the methodology of his directing later films. Schrader even notes that film noir was ideally suited to the low-budget B film, and many of the best noir films were B films. Moreover, the stylistic homogeneity outlined by Place likely has less to do with intentional style and more to do with the competing tendency against innovation, which encouraged a degree of unity among the B thrillers. By analyzing pre-war American films, it becomes clear that film noir is not so much something new and unprecedented in American cinema, but a revitalization of two versions of urban America, the gangster and the fallen woman film, that had been repressed after the first enforcement of the production code in 1935. Yet the French weren't completely off base in noticing differences between the crime films of the 30s and the crime films of the 40s and 50s. While Siodmak and Lang's American films were appreciated in their time less for their aesthetic difference than for their revival and refinement of an established crime cycle or tradition, they weren't thematically the exact same as their gangster film predecessors. For one thing, there was a general post-war trend to shift the site of crime from the realm of the ethnic underclass to a bourgeois milieu, as Americans were eager to see a more bourgeois view of themselves, and crime had to move to the suburbs. Moreover, anxiety about women's role in society changed after women entered the workforce en masse during World War II, and the attitudes towards women evidenced in film noir, i.e., fear of loss of stability, identity, and security, are reflective of the dominant feelings of the time. There was also a tonal shift in post-war films. Never before had films dared to take such a harsh and uncomplimentary look at American life. And as soon as the war was over, American films became markedly more sardonic. These changes in the conventions of American crime dramas had less to do with directors intentionally starting a new cinematic movement and more to do with Hollywood shifting to deliver entertainment to an increasingly disillusioned American populace. Though the films constituting the film noir movement are all American, not taking into account the alleged inspiration from German Expressionism and other foreign cinema, film noir has a lot more to do with French film criticism and scholarship than American film history, and it is more of a French movement than an American one. The creation of the category of film noir by French critics is an extension of French existential and surrealist philosophy, and the development of auteur theory. According to Noir, the French were predisposed to invent noir because it evoked a golden age of their own cinema, and French existentialism was intertwined with a residual surrealism, which was crucial for the reception of any art described as noir. Moreover, film noir and auteur began to work in tandem, expressing the same values from different angles. Film noir was less of a way of analyzing American cinematic culture than it was a way for French film critics to reflect on French culture. Younger critics at Caget began to project Bazin's ideas onto films noir, which became existential, depoliticized allegories of the white male condition. The French admiration for film noir largely stems from the critics' assertion that these post-war American crime dramas reflects French critiques of American culture and reifies French intellectuals' belief in existential and surrealist philosophy. Film noir credits the U.S., at the heart of its belief in progress and optimism, with a fiercely critical, authentically negative view of American society and its institutions, thus flattering precisely those French intellectuals whose left-wing political convictions and surrealist aesthetic predilections obliged them to pay this compliment in the first place. As Elsasser notes, German Expressionism functions in post-World War I European cinema rather similarly to the way film noir functions in post-World War II cinema, because of the peculiarly French element embedded in the origins of the idea of German Expressionist cinema, and thus film noir itself. Even the pulp story influences of some films noir were related by French intellectuals to their philosophy. Several themes of French existential philosophy had been elaborated through readings of such novelists such as Hammett, Chandler, and Kane. It seems that in order to justify their love of American cinema in congruence with their philosophical worldviews, French critics made any connections they could, regardless of the true historical basis for the development of American crime dramas in the 1940s and 1950s. Film noir is not an American cinematic movement. It was not simply the work of auteurs such as Robert Siodmak or Fritz Lang, hearkening back to their alleged German Expressionist heritage while vehemently critiquing the American status quo. Rather, the group of films categorized as film noir, which is a flexible and fraught canon, reflects the American tradition of crime films from the Depression, developing and adapting for a new audience with new concerns and demographics. Film noir is an idea created by French critics noticing differences in American cinema since they had last seen it in the late 30s. As Noir writes, film noir belongs to the history of ideas as much as to the history of cinema. It has less to do with a group of artifacts than with a discourse. Film noir is both an important cinematic legacy and an idea that we have projected onto the past. Indeed, film noir, despite its questionable basis, shaped a lot of film theory and criticism, and even had an impact on discourses outside the realm of media studies, such as feminist analysis of female archetypes in the 1940s and 1950s cinema. As Elsasser writes, film noir functions as the very signifier of metacinema, of a cinema made out of cinema. And film noir analysis paved the way for academic film theory, and the analysis of cinema is not just entertainment spewed out by money-hungry producers, but an art form that both impacts and reflects its culture's contemporary and historical society.